Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is January 23rd, 2022, and I'm your host, James Myers. It is a pleasure to be joined in dialogue by participants from the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you have been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. Today we will cover from the beginning to 77c of the Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates discusses the nature of the soul with his friends assembled on the day of his execution. As always, to focus our discussion, I have suggested three themes which are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. I'll invite participants to exchange their thoughts on today's reading, and as they do so, I will briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. We can go in any direction the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. To contribute your thoughts, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. Using the first name from your screen profile, I will call on you to speak in the order that hands are raised, giving precedence to those who haven't spoken before. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome any participants who wish to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. With Phaedo today, we can expand on themes introduced 2 weeks ago in our dialogue on Philebus, including the unlimited and limited, and the ratios of these opposites in our becoming. We can consider how knowledge of the equal, which we can think of as the point of no difference or no opposite, allows the soul to apply reason in the present. Socrates states categorically that all things in the present come to be from opposites, and it is the soul's task to find equivalence in their combinations. Of course, no two of us would always judge physical things equally. For example, what you call a coffee mug, I might call a teacup, and they both work well for either purpose. But Socrates' point is that our souls retain forever the idea of equal, and therefore its opposite, the idea of different. It is to the equal, Socrates says, that we compare our sensory inputs in determining the relative nature and purpose of the physical objects that surround us. Relativity of one thing to another, and their sequencing, are key to knowledge and recollection, as highlighted in both Phaedo and Philebus. It's worth recalling that everything physical is in continuous motion. Nothing stops to allow us to take a precise measure of equal and opposite. The ground beneath our feet rotates at 460 meters per second, and the Earth orbits the Sun at 30,000 meters per second, and so do our bodies. Our knowledge of all things physical is therefore limited by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It says that our measurement of a physical object's present position is not equal to our knowledge of its speed and the direction of its mass from past to future. Perhaps with this modern appreciation of inequality in physical knowledge, we can appreciate all the more Socrates' argument for the equal as the boundary between what a thing is and what it is not. The immaterial soul is not subject to the uncertainty principle, but Socrates asserts the soul can easily be confused by our 5 physical senses, as illustrated by the allegory of the cave in the Republic. Therefore, Socrates reasons, to approach pure knowledge in life, a philosopher aims to achieve, as closely as possible, separation of body and soul. Such a condition of separation is finally attained on death, to which Socrates is happily departing. Being born with no knowledge of the physical world, what is the source of our idea of the equal? Socrates says the equal is permanently imprinted on the soul, which exists before birth and after death. Do we agree with him that death is the separation of soul from body, and that the soul survives without the body? But if the soul dies with the body, then what is the source of the soul of a newborn? If the soul survives death as a continuum without beginning or end, then is it true that the soul recollects what it knew before? Does the soul's capacity for reason always strive to reach that which is equal? To approach these questions and the question of the soul's immortality, let's start by reading from 70d to 71c, with Socrates' reasoning about things coming to be in opposites and the balance of equality in the 2 processes of becoming. And let's review what Plato means by becoming in the middle of the opposites of being and non-being in the context of the uncertainty principle. And so let me share my screen and put up the reading. And if everybody can see my screen. I thought we would read this part from 70D to 71C. It's relatively short. It's between Socrates and Cebes. And I'm just wondering if I would have a volunteer to read either part. I could do Socrates if no one else wants, or
I'll be CBs. I'm always good for that, James.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Moshe. All right. Well, I'll do Socrates then, if that's all right. So this is, again, talking about this idea of equal and opposites. And so Socrates starts off by saying, let us examine it in some such a manner as this, whether the souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not. We recall an ancient theory that souls arriving there come from here, and then again that they arrive here and are born here from the dead. Do not confine yourself to humanity if you want to understand this more readily, but take all animals and all plants into account. And, in short, for all things which come to be, let us see whether they come to be in this way, that is, from their opposites, if they have such, as the beautiful is the opposite of the ugly, and just of the unjust, and 1,000 other things of this kind. Let us examine whether those that have an opposite must necessarily come to be from their opposite and from nowhere else. As, for example, when something comes to be larger, it must necessarily become larger from having been smaller before.
Yes.
And if something smaller comes to be, it will come from something larger before, which became smaller.
That is so.
And the weaker comes to be from the stronger, and the swifter from the slower?
Certainly.
Further, if something worse comes to be, does it not come to be from the better, and the juster from the unjust?
Of course.
So we have sufficiently established that all things come to be in this way, opposites from opposites.
Certainly.
Here's a further point, something such as this about these opposites. Between each of these pairs of opposites, there are two processes, from one to the other, and then again from the other to the first. Between the larger and the smaller, there is an increase and decrease, and we call the one increasing and the other decreasing.
Yes.
And so too, there is separation and combination, cooling and heating, and all such things, even if sometimes we do not have a name for the process, but in fact, it must be everywhere that they come to be from one another, and that there is a process of becoming from each into the other?
Assuredly.
Well then, is there an opposite to living, as sleeping is the opposite to being awake?
Quite so.
What is it?
Being dead.
Therefore, if these are opposites, they come to be from one another, and there are two processes of generation between the two?
Of course.
Thank you, Moshe, for that. And so I just wanted to get people's views on this, this idea of coming to be from opposites, and we'll go on later, I think, towards the end of today's session and talk about this idea of recollection, that one thing triggers a memory of an opposite or something similar. So it's always this kind of process, and we think in opposites is what they're trying to say at the end of today's reading. And I'm just wondering about this idea of, things coming to be from opposites and, your own experience. Is this kind of, does this sound relevant? Can you think of examples, other practical examples other than what they talk about here, for example, this idea, sleeping being the opposite of awake, and this leads to then, I think, a discussion of whether the soul exists after death and before birth, what's the opposite of each of those two processes. There's also this idea of two processes that Socrates introduces here, this idea of when you go from one thing to another, then you have to go back. There's actually a good reading on that. It's actually in the next section here that I've got highlighted on the screen from 72A to 72D. Maybe I'll just read this part as well, and we can talk about this too in connection with what we've just read, but we'll take Moshe, your thoughts?
Okay. This is a tricky question, obviously. Opposites, I think in the contemporary terms, would be called contraries. Opposites are not contradictories. It's not greater and not greater, lesser and not lesser, but you've got, greater as opposed to lesser, and hotter and colder, and higher and lower. And contraries are funny. Let me just take the higher and lower and change that into up and down. Okay. And suppose I, built a ladder, an extraordinary ladder to be sure, that went from here to the moon. And I would start climbing up the ladder. And I'm climbing up and up and up and up. And then I get to a point when I'm actually climbing down and down and down and down, but I have not changed my direction. So up and down being contraries, both can happen at the same time, or is there some sort of confusion there? If we go to the greater and lesser, I'm thinking of my. I don't have an older brother, but if I had an older brother, I can imagine the time when my older brother would be greater, he would be taller, and as I grew, I eventually became equal, and then he became smaller. But he didn't change. Okay, just like the direction of the person climbing up the ladder didn't change. Alice in Wonderland gives us all sorts of examples of contraries at work. So I wonder if we press Plato on this, if he can really hold fast and true to this idea of contraries that he has, and that opposites coming from opposites.
An interesting thought there, and I hadn't realized that use of the term the term contraries. But it makes me think, maybe in some of the examples that you gave, Moshe, that maybe these are terms that apply in some sort of ratio between things. It takes me back, I think, to our discussion 2 weeks ago of Philebus, and that distinction that Socrates made between the unlimited and the limited, whereas in the limited, you necessarily have a fixed number of things. In the unlimited, you don't have a fixed number, and that's where terms like larger and smaller come in terms of relativity, expressing relativity. When you can't express a defined number, you have to express things relative to each other. And I like the example you gave of if you had an older brother, at one point he would be taller or larger than you, but then that doesn't necessarily hold for all time. So it's kind of this idea of relativity. And so it's an interesting use of the word contraries. And I wonder if we do see a difference between the idea of contraries and opposites. So it's a good question that you raised. It makes me think, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm wondering what others' views are on that. Steve.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines. I would say it a little differently. So say if we think of a baby elephant is large, it is large, but it's not large if you from the perspective of a full-grown elephant, then it's small. So it's both large and small. And the idea of what he's trying to, it seems like he's trying to use it as a proof, and to say that something something large comes from something small, or something small comes from something large. I don't see how that proof necessarily holds true. I mean, sometimes, if you have a snowball going down a mountain, it's going from small to large. And then when it melts, it goes from large to small. But, a baby elephant, genetically comes from something large, but I don't think in this example it's coming from something large, but I think it's more the relativity isn't really, a concept that was being used. So I was thinking the same sort of thing as Moshe was.
Well, thanks. I think that's something that we definitely need to explore in this. Is the proof sufficient? And I think this is fairly early in the dialogue, where they haven't fully established all of the terms of what they're talking about. But I think we can look further in a dialogue, and we can see if this is necessarily the case, in fact, or whether there's some holes in the argument. I'm wondering, actually, this idea of a reference point, for example. So if something is said to be large, what is it large with reference to? And is it large with reference to that which is smaller, or is it large with reference to some sort of universal point that we can all refer to and all say that everything with respect to that universal point is larger, and or anything greater than that universal reference point is larger, and anything less than that universal reference point is smaller? So these are all good questions, and I think we have to look for that kind of proof and see if we accept what Socrates is saying, that do all things come to be from opposites? Jose, what are your thoughts?
Yes, the first thing I try to discern is we typically use the smaller, taller when we compare something to something else, right? My cousin is taller than my brother, or my house is bigger than your house, or my car is faster than your car. We typically use that then a comparison. But in this case, he's referring to the same object. So it's not referring to an elephant is large. He's saying the same object to be smaller had to be bigger before, and the same object to be bigger had to be smaller before. And that's, I think, more understandable. You yourself, or your shoe size, or your height cannot be taller than before if you were not smaller before, and vice versa. If you shrink with age, I mean, you couldn't be less tall now than before if you were not taller before. So that's the way I chose to interpret it, is opposites of the same object, as opposed to comparisons. That's all I want to say.
And thank you. I think that's a point that we can maybe appreciate here, as we look back on the words that they used, or that Socrates used, sleeping from waking, for example, those, I guess, could be the same object in the term that in the sense that you used, Jose, in the sense that they are states of consciousness, so with respect to that state of consciousness, that being the same object, then you have these opposites. You have one extreme of the state, which is of the state which is sleeping, and the other extreme of the state, which is wakefulness. And so maybe that's one good way of thinking about it. So thank you for raising that. And then we'll go to Bill, and then Jose J.
Well, I agree with Jose that maybe a good way of understanding it is to compare it to itself. And I think everything in life certainly does grow and get smaller. It's a natural thing. We grow from little ones to big ones, and then the body decays, or the substance decays, and they get small again. And even in the physical world with mountains and valleys and rivers, same thing. So in that sense, yes, we all come from small and we go to big, and then we go to small again. But the other point was the opposites. Everything comes from opposites. That's a different issue. Small and big are just natural things, I think. And but coming from opposites, a little bit trickier. I'm not quite sure how to figure that one out. Coming from, say, a good person to a bad person, then back to a good person. From a criminal to a saint, back to a criminal. I haven't figured that one out yet. So maybe someone can help me.
A good question. I think that I wonder if if he's saying that if you are good, that you necessarily were bad at one point, or whether those terms opposites are comparative terms, and then somewhere in the middle we find that the equal between good and bad, which is neither good nor bad, to which we're making the comparison. And maybe that's an example, Bill, of state of being, a good state of being versus a bad state of being. And this idea of coming to be, you come to be from a certain point, and that point may be defines the two opposites. So maybe that's just a thought there that we can explore. Jose J.
Yeah, I find that there is I don't know if there is a little bit of is a hole in the argument, because he jumps from comparing things relative, they are relative, to things that they are absolute. For example, you can be more good or less good, or tall or more tall or less or shorter, etc. But he uses that to reach the conclusion that death comes from life, and life comes from death. You cannot be less death or more death or less alive. So I don't know. This jumping is a little bit suspicious for me.
I think, and thanks for raising that distinction of you can't be more dead. And I think maybe that's referring to the body as opposed to the soul. And I think he's trying to make a point here about the nature of the soul. And they'll go on to say it's a lengthy proof that the soul exists both after death and before birth. That's how this dialogue winds up later on, that we'll see in a later session. But maybe it's that distinction of the physical versus that which is not physical, and the physical is always in one certain state or the other. But maybe the not physical thing, the soul, is not subject to that. So that's definitely a thought that we can explore, and I think we need to look for more proof. I think is what we're discussing here, is that we're not satisfied with just what they're offering in this particular reading. Bill, further thoughts on that?
In terms of the soul surviving after death, that's a tricky one for me. But it may not be like an intact being that survives, even I don't know how to express this, but it could be just that when we die, that our something lives on in the world amongst other people, in terms of what we thought, what we taught to other people, and how we've acted in our lives. And maybe that's what the soul is, just a remembrance in other folks. I don't know if that has anything to do with what he's talking about here, but that's how I think of the soul, remaining behind.
It's actually a really good point, as we'll wind up today's session talking about this idea of recollection. And certainly I think we do recall the souls of others, or the living souls of others who have since died. I think Socrates is getting more specific, though, that the soul itself lives not just in other memories, but it itself persists. So the soul in itself is a term that he uses a number of times, and I think that's something that we definitely need to explore. But it doesn't negate what you said, Bill, in terms of memory of the soul persisting in others, which is maybe we can find the intersection of that memory in others and then this possible existence of the soul in itself. JK, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, is he making a distinction between memory, personal memory, and recollection? It's because it seems like recollection is something that you have that is, beyond one's personal memory. That you think of your consciousness, or maybe it's your consciousness. Is there like a distinct demarcation between the conscious and the unconscious? Maybe they kind of bleed into one another. But at a certain point, the recollection is beyond personal memory.
Mm.
So you're born into the world with certain inherent capabilities, instincts. You could call them instincts, or you could call them, memories, recollections of how to do things. It's like a baby is born with the sucking reflex, right? The sucking. If baby wasn't born with that sucking ability, it wouldn't be able to survive. Where'd that come from? Did the baby learn that? Yeah, right. The baby didn't learn how to suck at the nipple, right? But that would be an example, a very obvious example of a kind of inborn, inherent, ability to do something. So there's a kind of a recollection, you could say, or it's in the genes, right? Or it's in the genes. So the genes might be a kind of an indication of a carrier of these recollections or inherent inborn abilities, right, or potentialities, and that would be like maybe defining what the soul might be. The soul is just more than just more than your personal memories that you learn in life.
You raise a number of interesting thoughts there, and it makes me think, this distinction of the word between memory and recollection, the distinction of those two words is something that Socrates talked about in Philebus. Memory was something he said in Philebus that pertains to the physical. So the physical body has a certain memory, and that may be what you were referring to in terms of those, the reflexes of a newborn. Has that sucking ability, to be able to survive, and maybe that's an example of a physical memory versus a recollection, which in Philebus Socrates says belongs to the soul, and recollection is in the soul, and it's the logical sequence of events that occurred. What caused this, what caused that. What reactions follow what actions, I think that's more what he was talking about in terms of recollection. So there is that distinction between those two words in Philebus. And then certainly here, where we'll end up today's discussion is where they're talking about the use of the equal in our function of recollection. So he's saying that when we recall in sequences. So if you mention, a particular word like Plato, my very next thought would be of something that's either the same or different from Plato. So if you say Plato, I might then think of Socrates, or I might think of Aristotle, or I might think of dialogue, so there's all this progression of, sequential progression of recollection based on the triggering of equals and opposites, for which we require knowledge of the equal. And that's what he said that we're born with. We're born with the knowledge of the equal, he says. We're not born with physical knowledge. We might be born maybe with physical memory, as you say, but not with physical knowledge. So I'm wondering, is that a fair interpretation of what you've said? And I'm wondering what others think about that kind of idea of what we're born with. This is something that we can look at our next reading as well, and we'll go to Moshe.
Well, just to be fair, we're born not only with the notion or idea of equal, but we're born also with all of those other the ideas of virtue and justice and truth and things like that as well. So I don't want to limit it to, and I know that you didn't mean to do that, but I just wanted to point out that all those other things that are in dispute between people, Socrates or Plato is going to hold that we're born with those at the same time.
Right, and that's something that we can certainly look at as well. And he does offer in this part of our dialogue a discussion about virtue and how that applies. So is virtue something that we exercise in constraining our bodily impulses? He has a good example of whether virtue whether somebody is brave, in facing death because they have overcome their fear of the disappearance of the body. And he says, no, that's not a definition of brave. That's actually just we're reacting to bodily fear in that sense. And then he uses the same sort of comparison to moderation. He says the body is licentious, and if we think that we overcome the body's impulses towards this licentiousness, that makes us moderate. He says, no, that's not what makes us moderate. It's this idea of wisdom is something that we apply internally that doesn't react necessarily to what the body's doing, because he says the body confuses things. So a very interesting question that you bring up with respect to virtue and how or what form that is present in us when we are born. Is a very interesting question. Something I hadn't thought about specifically is what form that is in. Is it fully formed? Is it something that we are born with a notion of it, and that we form it in greater detail over the course of our lives? So we'll go to Steve or sorry, Moshe, did you have a follow-up on that? Or
yeah, I just wanted to follow up at about 75C, where Socrates says, and if we acquire this knowledge before we are born, and we are born having the use of it, then we also know before we are born, and at the instant of birth, not only the equal or the greater or the less, but all other ideas. For we are not speaking only of equality, but of beauty, goodness, justice, holiness, and all of that which is stamped with the name of essence in the dialectical process.
Thank you. And that's actually, I appreciate your calling that into attention, because that does make it clearer that, what he's talking about, that idea of those virtues that we are born with, or the way that he expresses it. So thank you for that. Steve, and then Jose.
A quick point of order. I don't think he's actually proven to us yet that we are born with all those things, that we are born with all the forms, but something I think that needs to be established yet.
I would agree, and I think it does relate to this idea of the equal, and how we understand and apply the equal. So we'll go to Jose.
Yeah, something related to this, especially to the soul. I did a mental, how do you call it? A mental experiment?
A thought
experiment? Some time ago. Eh?
A thought experiment, yeah.
A thought experiment. And I said to myself, the population in the world is growing. Therefore, there are not enough souls to replenish the new bodies. So where are these souls coming from? If you believe that, in fact, there is the soul after death goes to the underworld, then there will never be enough to cover all the growing population, right? Because there are going to be more newborns than there are more deaths. So I said, so where do these come from? And then a little bit, not convinced myself, but I thought about, nowhere here says that the souls are different. That when I die, you die, etc. The soul separates from the body decays, and the soul goes to the underworld. But it doesn't say that my soul is going to be different than James' soul or Steve's soul. So what begs the question, if in fact, when we are born, if there's such a thing as a soul, it is a standard soul, to put it that way. They're all the same, to use the term of equality. And then it is your life that you will make more of the capabilities or potentialities of your soul what you do. But all the souls are the same. There's only one in the underworld, and they get replicated to everybody who is born, because otherwise there won't be enough souls around to replicate. Anyway, it's a thought I had some time ago, and it just reminded me of that thought.
It's a fascinating thought, actually, and thought experiments certainly lead to great discoveries over time, and I think it's a very interesting idea that there could be a limit on the number of available souls, and did the number of people being born exceed the rate at which souls are being recycled through the system? So you raise the question whether a new soul coming into a newborn is like a mixture maybe of souls that have existed before. And I think you made the point, like, is there eventually one soul from which all souls emerge? And I think these are critical questions that we can explore. I think certainly, I'm trying to remember, I think it was in the Republic where I think Socrates stated that there was actually a finite number of souls. I'd have to go back and find that reference. But I think you raised the important point here, and certainly something that we need to consider as we, look at Socrates' soul about to depart and what's going to happen with it. We'll go to Moshe and then Jose.
I have a real, this is just a personal note, but I have a real problem with the idea of a standard soul, because we would have the logical problem of the identity of indiscernibles. How would we know that this soul is supposed to go into that body? I mean, how do you choose them? And certainly God would not be able to know that unless you're Leibniz. And also in the Phaedrus, Socrates talks about, or Plato talks about, how the individual souls claw and scratch at each other to get closer to the forms. So they do take with them, at least in Platonic terms, a certain knowledge which enables Plato to go on and differentiate between, those souls that have the greater amount of knowledge from those that have less. You become a philosopher, you become a politician, you become a dentist, and and things like that. I just wanted to share with I guess it was Jose G, what I see as a problem in the idea of a standard soul.
And certainly, Moshe, you raised the point, not just in Phaedrus, but in a number of other dialogues where Plato says that every time the soul comes to life, it has to pay some price for what it did in previous lives, or reap the benefits of what it did in previous lives. And so I think we saw in the Republic that there is this 1,000-year cycle for souls, and the penalty that a bad person would pay, or that a soul that had become bad would pay after it dies, is 10 times worse than what it did to others when it was embodied in life. And so definitely it seems that there is this memory of soul's characteristics. But it is an interesting question. Are all souls completely separate from each other, or is there some point at which all souls eventually connect? And I think maybe in this dialogue is one that he's saying that this point of the equal maybe is the point where all souls connect. But I haven't really quite imagined what this point of equal would look like. I mean, how do we set that out in some sort of paradigm that we can understand? But it's a really interesting thought experiment, and your response, Moshe, I think makes us think about how we can go in that sort of thought experiment. We'll go to Jose J.
Hi. Yes, I was going to comment, but you commented that in the Phaedrus, like Plato says that depending what you did in this life, this 1,000-year cycle, etc. So not all the souls are equal. So they come and they reincarnate according to what they did. Another concept another idea that they have this thing of recollection and the immortality of the soul. I think this is essential for Plato, the theory of forms. Because in the theory of forms, we have two worlds. We have the physical world, and we have the world of the ideas or the forms. And they are different worlds. So now, so if we are in this world, how can we grasp the concepts, the ideas that they have in the other world. There is no connection. There is no way. So now, Plato, to resolve this problem, well, he proposed that the soul is immortal, and the soul lives in the forms world and comes to the real world, to the physical world. So the soul is the connection between these two, and how he brings the forms to the physical world is this. So he brings this knowledge because they live there. The soul, they live in the forms, so they bring to the physical world. They live all this form knowledge, but they forget. He said they forget at birth, and it's only like a little idea. So the way that you can learn, you can you never learn the forms. You recollect. So this is the whole point. This is very essential in his theory of forms. This recollection and the way that he says that the souls, they live in the formed world, that they come back to earth, etc.
Really good way that you explain that, I think, Jose. This idea of you don't learn the forms, you recollect the forms, and maybe that's where we'll kind of arrive at an understanding at the end of today's discussion. And certainly, you pointed out the difference between the physical and the world or the realm that the soul lives in, which is not physical. I mean, the physical realm is visible. The realm that the soul lives in is invisible. And we'll see this in our next session, where we'll look at the next part of Phaedo, where they make that distinction between the visible and the invisible. And they make it in the context of the composites and the non-composites. And the composites are the physical elements in the universe, and the non-composites are those things that exist in the invisible universe, and that would include the soul. The non-composites, Socrates will say, are those things which are not broken up and they're not dispersed on death. They exist forever, whereas the composites come and go, and the composites are physical. So it's an interesting distinction that you made, and certainly I think actually I've got a slide here on this idea of physical knowledge, and maybe we can take a look at that before I do the next reading. We'll go to Bill, though. Bill?
What came to mind was, how does our society improve in terms of, the care we take for one another, the improvements in our sensitivity to one another. And I think it's because of people who came before us. They've set the stage for society to grow. And in that sense, their soul lives on.
Mm-hmm. Good question. And it's, how do we advance? How do we learn from the good things that people in the past experienced? How do we learn from the bad things that happened in the past? And certainly the actions of one soul can resonate through time, I think is what you were saying. It's something that's very, very key for us to understand, is that when the body dies, memory or recollection of it, or what the animating force in it did, lives on. So that is certainly, I don't think there would be much dispute about that, but I think certainly the way that memories can be distorted is something that's very problematic, and something that Socrates talks about a lot in this section of the Phaedo that we're reading today. How the body can confuse the soul, and so I just wanted actually to go to this cover page on the notes that I've posted on the shared drive. And this is this, I'm actually very happy to find this image. It's, for those who can't see the screen, it's an image of a running body. So it's basically given the outline of the body, and it's shown it running forward in motion. The front part of the body is defined. So you can see it's a clearly defined body, but the back part of the body is dissipating into these pixels as the body runs. So as the body runs forward, the front part of the body is defined, but the back part of the body is disappearing. It's kind of almost, to me, it's a little bit of an illustration of the phenomenon in physics of entropy. So the front part of the body is well ordered, and entropy is maximum disorder, and that's what's happening in the back part of the body. So if you think about time, the front part of the body is headed towards the future, the back part of the body is headed to the past, and right in the middle is the present. And it's this problem with our knowledge of physics. What I talked about in the introduction, the uncertainty principle that physicist Werner Heisenberg first defined, and then mathematician Hermann Weyl set it out in mathematical form. So here I've got the mathematical form of the uncertainty principle on the screen. I've rewritten a couple of the terms, or I've expanded a couple of the terms, And so basically the uncertainty principle says that the more you know of an object's position in the present, and position would consist of 4 points, right? There'd be length, width, and depth. So that would be your spatial position, and then 1 point for your temporal position. So the more you know of those 4 points in the present about the position of a physical object, the less you know about its momentum, which is its mass times its velocity. And velocity is speed over time in a particular direction, in a particular vector. So the mathematical form of it is the standard deviation of position, or position is denoted by x, multiplied by the standard deviation of momentum, which is the simple p is used for momentum, is greater than or equal to. And there's this inequality that we have in physics. So we don't have this idea of the equal. There's this inequality. It could be either greater than or equal to. We don't know which. And it uses this term on the right-hand side of this expression. It's greater than or equal to the Planck constant, which is denoted by h. And the Planck constant is the smallest thing in the universe. It's the smallest physical thing in the universe. It's this crazy small 10 to the negative 34, I think it is. It's the smallest distance, the smallest mass, the smallest length, the smallest anything in the universe. And so you take that, you divide it by 2 pi, and then you further divide it by 2. And so we've got this inequality when we compare to the very smallest thing in the universe. And when I look at this expression, I think of the universe as the sum of all probabilities. And I think of this Planck constant as the minimum probability, at least the minimum probability in physics. And so we have this problem with our knowledge of physics. It will never be complete, because the more you know of an object's position, the less you know about its momentum, and vice versa. The more you know about its momentum, the less you know about its position. And I think this diagram, or this drawing, this pixelated drawing, kind of really illustrates the idea of the uncertainty principle. And so that's our problem with knowledge of physics. And then that's, I think, the whole idea behind what Plato is talking about in terms of, the soul having to apply reason and to understand things like the equal, because we see in our knowledge of physics this inequality, that position times momentum can be either equal to or greater than the Planck constant divided by 2 pi and further divided by 2. So I just wanted to make that point about this knowledge of physics, and I think the importance of understanding, I think, this kind of this uncertainty of our knowledge is something that kind of permeates Plato's works. We saw in the Republic, we see here as well, and that's that role of the soul, is to kind of navigate this uncertainty. So maybe with that, I just wanted to point that out, and just maybe go then to this reading, which I can do here. This is from 72a to d, and I think it was Moshe who mentioned Phaedrus. There's actually a connection I've made here to Phaedrus in this reading. So I'll just do this reading here, and then I'll make the connection to Phaedrus. So this is where Socrates says, "It is agreed between us then that the living come from the dead in this way, no less than the dead from the living. And if that is so, it seems to be sufficient proof that the souls of the dead must be somewhere whence they can come back again. Consider in this way, Ceres, that, as I think, we were not wrong to agree. If the two processes of becoming did not always balance each other, and if they were going round in a circle, but generation proceeded from one point to its opposite in a straight line, and it did not turn back again to the other opposite or take any turning, do you realize that all things would ultimately be in the same state, be affected in the same way, and cease to become? So to become is, I think, Plato's way of saying, to operate in the present, because the present is the state of becoming, or the state of coming to be. He goes on further to say, it is not hard to understand what I mean. If, for example, there was such a process as going to sleep, but no corresponding process of waking up, you realize that in the end, everything would show the story of Endymion to have no meaning. And just to break there, Endymion was granted eternal rest by Zeus. So this story of having eternal rest would have no meaning. There would be no point to it because everything would have the same experience as he and be asleep. And if everything were combined and nothing separated, the saying of Anaxagoras would be true, that all things were mixed together. And in that, I guess he's saying that there would be no difference between things. And so he concludes by saying, in the same way, my dear Ceres, if everything that partakes of life were to die and remain in that state and not come to life again, would not everything ultimately have to be dead and nothing alive? Even if the living come from some other source, and all that lived died, how could all things avoid being absorbed in death? And it's that word source that's used here that I connected to Phaedrus. Phaedrus 245c to 246c, Socrates said, in fact, this self-mover, talking about, I guess the soul, or the force of animation, the self-mover is also the source and spring of motion in everything else that moves, and a source has no beginning. That is because anything that has a beginning comes from some source, but there is no source for this, since a source that got its start from something else would no longer be the source. And since it cannot have a beginning, then necessarily it cannot be destroyed. That is because if a source were destroyed, it could never get started again from anything else, and nothing else could get started from it. That is, if everything gets started from the source. This, then, is why a self-mover is a source of motion, and that is incapable of being destroyed or starting up. Otherwise, all heaven and everything that has been started up would collapse, come to a stop, and never have cause to start moving again. So that was the footnote that I added to this word source in 72a to d. And so there's particular logic in there, and I'm just wondering what everyone thinks about this logic, this idea that things come to be in this two processes. So you come to be from one opposite to the other, and then from that back to the first opposite, or maybe contraries if we use the term that Moshe raised at the beginning. And this idea that they have to balance each other, and the word balance here means reaching an equal. Right? So you can't have one opposite or one contrary prevailing over the other. And then this idea of source, what is, if something is the source, it cannot have another source. There can only be one source. So just, what are your thoughts about the logic that he's presenting here? This idea that if these two processes ever stopped, everything would just cease to become. There would be no present. Moshe, your thoughts?
Well, you bring up a lot of interesting things. I mean, to go back to your idea expressed by the picture that you had, and you used the word entropy. The paragraph, the first paragraph that we read, anticipates, a modern physical view that entropy will, ultimately the universe will simply stop heating itself up, and it will just start to become disordered, and everything will simply evaporate. Okay, so if the second law of thermodynamics is true, and everything just does continue to go into into a state of chaos, then ultimately what we will have, it will be as if everything ceased to become. Okay, so that was a very interesting observation. I mean, I think Plato's, right on with that. On the other hand, we do have something like I'll call it, for lack of a better term, it's descriptive, but not particularly meaningful, is the concept of life, or maybe it's meaningful but not particularly descriptive. Because in order to be able to have life, you've got to be able to have energy, you've got to be able to have self-replication, you've got to have duplication, you have to be able to perform work. And all of these things are necessary in the world of becoming. So in the physical world, we have something that is actually, what's the word for it? It's contra entropy. Okay, it's something that actually resists the physical process of losing its system, of going into a state of chaos, a state of disorganization. So to the extent that the world, whatever that is living, we will constantly have becoming. But if the physical universe itself follows the laws of thermodynamics, then ultimately it will overcome even living, and everything will just go into a state of non-becoming. So that's what I take as interesting about about that paragraph that you had there, and also tying that into your idea of the soul being the self-mover, the self-moving mover, which is something that is constantly, to the best of its ability, self-replicating and continuing to, it's alive and continuing to become.
Thank you. And I really like the way that you said that we have this power to resist entropy. So if the physical universe, I think scientists agree that entropy is what happens left to its own. The physical universe goes from a state of order to a state of maximum disorder, and that's entropy. And maximum disorder is just, there's no organization of anything, there's no shape, there's no form of anything. All points just disperse to nothingness. But as you said, we have this power, that this self-mover inside us has this power to resist entropy, and I really like that. That's I think that's a good way of putting it and thinking about it. And I hadn't really thought about that power of resistance before in that way. So I think that's interesting, and that ties, I think, to this quote from Phaedrus from 245c to 246c. And again, this problem that we would have if the soul were to stop, how would it ever get started again? If it just blows off into the wind, as Seebe's in particular fears in this dialogue, how is the soul ever going to get started again? What's going to arrive in the newborn? So maybe let's get into this question. Like, do we think this, if we think the soul dies with the body, then how does a soul come to being? So maybe that's the question that we need to confront at this point. Your thoughts, JK?
Yeah, this idea of entropy is that it's agreed upon in science there's a kind of this second law of thermodynamics leads to this ultimate dissolution, right? But is that philosophically agreed upon that's a kind of like a one-way street? Because you mentioned there's this, what is the counter to entropy? I mean, perhaps that should be entertained as well, that there is this other force that counters entropy, that brings about order. And it's like you mentioned that there's a balance in this passage, that But does that mean that like the world we're living in, if there are, too many souls here, is it going to counterbalance that with, with the more deaths, more destruction, in order to counterbalance the overpopulation of souls? Because it seems like we're heading towards that kind of precipice of maybe global collapse, right, of sorts, and maybe we need to start over again or something, or it's a counterbalancing of, it's a way of balancing out the and bringing us back to what is normal, because we have 7 billion people in Mother Earth, and what's really comfortable, comfortable is around 3 billion people, and there's just not enough resources to feed everyone, right? At this, and without causing major problems in pollution and deprivation and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of balancing the numbers of souls, I guess, and I think it's actually closer to 8 billion souls now on planet Earth, and so is there some point where that balance gets exceeded? Certainly, I think it was in the Critias where they start off by talking about these cyclic, destruction events, and whether we're headed for one or not is anybody's guess, but maybe with the right amount of knowledge, we can, find an appropriate balance and save ourselves. But that would seem to be a task of the soul then, to find that path to restore that balance. But when I see the word balance here in 72A, this idea of balancing each other, it's this constant process of generation. So you can't let the generator ever stop. The generator always has to find that balance, because if it tips too much one way or the other, then there'll be too much or too little, and either way we'll wind up in some sort of destruction, right? So I think it's always that point of balance, which, as I said in the introduction, if you think of the equal as the point of no difference, maybe that point of no difference is actually the most important point in this physical universe, which consists of just infinite numbers of differences. So lots to think about in this, I think. Steve, your thoughts?
My understanding of second law of thermodynamics about entropy is that entropy, or systems dissipate heat or motion in a closed system. So if you take the universe as a whole, it's a closed system. But if you take the Earth and life on Earth, it's not a closed system. It's not like life is anti-entropy. It's happening in, like the life on Earth is coming because we're getting energy from the sun. So it'd be like the example that I've heard used is like a teenager's room could be organized. If the parent comes in and organizes the rooms, but after a while, that there's only really that one, few states where it could be organized, but then there could be multiple states of disorganization, and over time, left without any energy put in from the outside, it would dissipate into, entropy or disorganization per se. So, but to your earlier question about the where does this life come from, and one of the ways that I've heard it described as in just like the teenager's room, there's clumpiness in the universe. There's in this total system of the universe, there's parts where things are, there's randomization, and during that randomization, certain parts are clumped together. So you have, so you can have the source. One explanation I heard is that what you could say is let's say the rationale for how life came to be is by randomness in conditions. So just like you have, if if you have a system that is where there's energy that's closer together due to whatever fluctuations of that randomness, the dust from the Big Bang forming into nebulas, forming into stars, et cetera, forming into the Earth. So there's all of these occurrences that are caused by the physical laws of attraction and gravity, but eventually the trend is towards dissolution of all that, not non-existence, but as the non-becoming, as was stated earlier. So that was my 2 cents.
And the use of the word randomness, Steve, I think is an interesting one that makes me think again about probabilities that I mentioned with respect to the Planck constant. If I see the Planck constant as a minimum probability, and in the physical universe, and if there are these randomness, areas in the universe, as you said, the clumpiness. I guess you could consider maybe the existence of a planet in the middle of interstellar space to be kind of clumpiness, or not in interstellar space, but in a solar system to be an evidence of, to be an example of clumpiness, maybe. And that's where more probabilities have occurred than, in contrast to interstellar space where there is no clumpiness. So it's an interesting thought to think, what is the end of the universe, if there is an end of the universe. I think some people posit the idea of the big freeze, which is just, if you take the second law of thermodynamics to its natural conclusion, everything just reaches maximum disorder and then nothing happens. The present disappears at that point in the big freeze. There is no present. There's just past. But then the question is, well, how would such a system have come to be? Like, how would time come to be in that way? What started time going in the first place? What started it flowing in the first place? If time is this difference between past and future, what we call the present, then does the present always have to exist, or is the present doomed to end in this sort of big freeze? Kind of like, it gives me some feeling of agency, maybe, to think, as Moshe said, that we have the power to resist this sort of entropy, and make change and cause certain orders to come into being. And I guess it's a question then whether the power of the soul, whether it's just souls on this planet or whether there's souls elsewhere in the universe, is the power of the soul sufficient to overcome the natural tendency of all of physics to entropy? That would be an interesting thought experiment. Could the power of the soul become so powerful as to resist all of entropy? I don't know if anybody wants to engage in that thought experiment.
Could I comment on that?
Yeah.
So if we go back to the first law of thermodynamics, is that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So the idea that there's a soul power that could create, defeat something, that there seems to be a problem with the logic there, but just based on that. If it can't be created then or destroyed, how could there be and again, I think with the entropy, it's within a closed system. If when we're looking at a soul, it's only functioning on the earth because it's getting energy from outside, from the sun.
Good points to highlight. I think that energy cannot be created or destroyed, and maybe that's something that we want to consider in terms of the soul. If you think of the soul as some sort of energy, then does that support the view that the soul can't be destroyed? Certainly, I think when Socrates always makes this distinction between being and becoming, being, he says, is always eternal, and you cannot add to or subtract from that which is eternal, because that which is eternal just always is. It's always the same. So you can never add to or subtract from it. And, but becoming is that state of differences. It's a state of different levels of order and different levels of disorder. And and then so, as you say, entropy, if it applies to a closed system, well, then is the universe a closed system? Or does it continually regenerate? And I think these words from 72A to D talk about this need of continuous regeneration. And, Plato was a geometer, and he used this term in a circle in this around 72B, as if it's going around in a circle. And, maybe we can consider some geometry of circles as maybe not necessarily a closed system. When you think of the ratio of the circumference to the diameter, there is no end to that ratio. There's no beginning to a circle, there's no end to a circle, and there's no end to the ratio of circumference to diameter. So maybe is that a little bit of a geometric clue here that he's giving to a universe that we now know is geometric. And this is Einstein's field equations established without a doubt that the universe is geometric. But then we've got these funny things like, when they look back in the telescopes and they see the cosmic microwave background, which is thought to be the kind of barrier that you can't see beyond, which exists in the first 300,000 years of the universe. They say that's actually remarkably uniform, remarkably, there's no clumpiness in that. So we've got this kind of uniform background to the universe, and then we've got these clumpy areas such as what we live in. So interesting thoughts. So thanks for that, Steve, and we'll go to JK.
Yeah, are we talking about the difference between science and philosophy? And because science is positing these laws of thermodynamics, entropy, and so forth, and this is all in terms of science, physical science theory, and philosophy is talking more about what is beyond the physical, right? What is beyond science, or inclusive of science, and that what is opposed to entropy might be the kind of these spiritual ideas, the soul and so forth, that Plato is talking about and other philosophers talk about. Particularly more recently is the philosopher named Bergson, who was in dispute with Einstein's. I think they even had a meeting where they argued about their opposing theories, and of course Einstein took the scientific physical explanations as being the correct one, and then Bergson took the other side, and Einstein became more popular after that. But Bergson's position is in terms of this more philosophical, spiritual view of duration and the elan vital, which is like the soul, in life. Whereas he also understood. He was also a scientist. He understood what the scientific position was, and he referred to it as mechanical and radically finalistic, and so that's just a way of talking about it. The science talks about things in terms of physical explanations, and you come to this kind of this idea of entropy. But that's just one the physicalist scientific point of view, as opposed to, I think Plato's talking more about the metaphysical position here.
Interesting. I'll have to look up Bergson, and certainly I think Einstein demonstrated a fair bit of philosophy in a number of things that he said. And it's a good point. How do we distinguish between philosophy and science? I think that distinction is maybe a more modern one, and that philosophy maybe can be considered a science itself. Maybe philosophy is the science of science. I don't know, but something that we can consider, that there is some knowledge out there beyond knowledge of just the physical, because the knowledge of the physical is subject to the uncertainty principle. And so what is it? What kind of science deals with uncertainty? Certainly, I think mathematics deals with that. Geometry deals with it. And certainly the kind of discussions that we're having today deal with it. So that's more in the realm of the soul, I would say. So good thoughts and good points. And we'll go to Johnny. I think I missed your hand earlier, so apologies for that.
No worries. But the last sentence in the second paragraph really stands out to me. It's, even if the living come from some other source and all that live died, how could all things avoid being absorbed in death? And my initial reaction to that was they can't. And I'm coming at it from the physical sense. In the physical world, everything that's here is not going to be here at some point in time. And this entire argument seems to be based on the fact that there's an assumption that there's a fixed number of souls. We don't know the laws of the world of form, so why would we assume, or why would Socrates assume that there's only a fixed number of souls? If we're thinking about life, we can't separate it from the physical world. So we know how the physical world operates. We can make theories, we can observe things with our senses, but the world of forms is completely out of our grasp. So I think if you take away that assumption that there's only a fixed number of souls, you get a completely different conversation.
Interesting. And let's look for that. Let's look for that idea of the fixed number of souls and see if that's something that can be supported, and see if that's something that Socrates says is precise or changes over time. An interesting thought. Moshe.
Okay. To JK's point, at this particular time in intellectual history, there was no distinction between philosophy and physics. Philosophy at that time, even up to the time of when Newton wrote his Principia, he wrote his Principia of natural philosophy. So like James said, this distinction, or a firm distinction between philosophy and physics is a relatively recent phenomenon. The other thing that I wanted to say, going back to this entropy, and a point that I can't remember who made it about clumpiness. Okay, if you remember Lucretius, the atomist, had all these different atoms, and they had different properties. Some of them had hooks, and some of them had other things that would enable them to interact in a way. But they were, in Lucretius, they were all going in a straight line. I presume that they were all going down. But we have physical. We do have a physical world, because some of the atoms would swerve off course, and they would collide and they would clump. Okay, and so it introduces the idea into the existence of the physical world of randomness, and this clumpiness of the atoms coming together, or what you had referred to earlier as composites. Okay, so that's a very ancient idea, and people certainly have not have that idea has not been lost on people in the present. The last thing that I wanted to observe, there are two things, but I think I'll only get to one of them, is this idea of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law is saying that the energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and the second law is saying that everything, that entropy is a physical law of the universe, and everything will simply get into, I think you called it a zero state or frozen state or something like that. I said that the universe, all matter simply evaporates. Some of the quantum physicists like to use the metaphor of how something, how a photon becomes a particle as opposed to a wave, and they talk about the wave collapsing. Okay. And that the wave collapses in a certain way due to some sort of interference, which is usually observation. But putting that aside, assuming that there's no observation, but there is, these waves do collapse occasionally, like the Lucretian atom that swerves out of the way. The energy in the universe could be maintained, but the second law of thermodynamics could be true at the same time, because the waves simply stop collapsing and everything just becomes a steady state. It's just, all the energy's there, but, nobody's waving into each other. We're not getting, to use the metaphor, non-scientific metaphor, we're not getting clumpiness anymore. I would like to comment on the finite number of souls and the infinite number of souls. Plato, at this particular point, I don't know if we need to have an infinite number of souls. We could just have a very large, finite number of souls and still have, people coming around. Or it might be the case that souls don't have to be recycled, that you simply get a soul when you get the proper accumulation of matter together to create a sentient entity like human beings, a sentient creature. And to beg the question completely, consciousness might simply be a very high form of sentience. It could be that it's not different than sentience. It's just a higher order of it. But that's a separate question. If you don't need to recycle souls, all you need to do is keep pumping out people, and you're going to keep pumping out souls. On the other hand, just to make a slightly facetious point, suppose there are only 3 billion souls in the universe, and we've got 8 billion people in the world. Then we've got 5 billion zombies, and given at least the political state in the United States, it might be true that we've got more zombies here than they have in other parts of the world. That's all I have to say. That last part was facetious.
Thank you. I won't make any editorial comment on that, but we can all have our thoughts on it. But you have some definitely fascinating perspectives there. I like that, the reference to the quantum wave collapse and, this observer effect that, that they know in physics. If you observe a beam coming through two slits, that its scattered pattern when it arrives on the wall or whatever is set up on the opposite side of the two slits, the scatter pattern is different than if you don't observe it. And I think that highlights the existence of two separate things in the universe. There is the observer, which is the soul, and there is the physically observed, which is the physical. And those kind of need to be kept separate. The observer is observing the physics, which is the observed. Is it in fact going to be this state where at some point the observer just disappears and that there will be no longer any difference? That would be the state at which everything is equal and there is no longer a difference. And I guess that's the point at which this generation that's being talked about, this continuous generation that's being talked about in 72A to D, would stop. But that would seem rather not a good outcome for all of our souls eventually. But yeah, let's consider that. I think it certainly gave you some interesting perspectives to think about. We'll go to JK and then Jose.
Yeah, I want to address this notion of the sameness of souls or the differences among souls. And I think of it in terms of like snowflakes. There's no two snowflakes that are alike. So the snowflakes coming through the atmosphere, they automatically take on a certain shape, a certain form, and but they merge, melt and merge into snow and so forth. The snow becomes water. So there's a certain kind of existence there of these snowflakes. You could call them beings, right? And each one is different. So by the same token, why couldn't there be an infinite number of souls, right? And none of them are the same, and they go back to where they came from, right? On the other hand, we assume that we're the only human beings are the only ones who have souls. Why couldn't things in the world, the other things in the world, leaves, trees, and so forth, animals, other particles have some kind of some sense of what we think of as souls. I mean, we don't know what they are. We don't really understand. We're a limited consciousness of within our within each of us, that we have a limited understanding of what those things are, the things in themselves, like Kant says, they're part of the nument that we don't really know. We can't know the thing in itself. We only know the appearance of them. So we assume a lot that we're the only ones who have souls. And in that sense, the soul might be just defined by whatever is there that's in the world. And each entity has some sense of a soul because they're in relation with everything else. It's just like we're in relation to everything else. Perhaps a soul is just defined as not individual, but it's just a relationship with our environment, with the world that we're in. Perhaps a soul is just like that. The sense of the world that we have of ourselves. And so it comes down to the question of what is the self? Is it just a entity with a kind of image of ourselves within each individual mind or brain or whatever? No, I think it's more than that. That's what would you be without the environment, the milieu that you're in, right? There's no individual that's separate from the world, right? So I think the soul maybe is a kind of a defined in a very limited way. In that sense, there is no limitation to to how many souls there are and what the soul is and so forth. We really don't know exactly. But I think Socrates and these Platonic dialogues are giving us a kind of a hint at what the soul might be.
Yeah, I think you made a number of really interesting points there. You mentioned the snowflakes, and that makes me think of fractal geometry. Where a fractal just continues to propagate according to a particular pattern, but the fractal can move around and combine with itself. And there can be differences in sizes and magnitudes in the fractal. And so that's an interesting connection that just occurred to me as we were talking about the snowflakes, because there is that certain similarity in the snowflake formation. You said you can't know the thing in itself. And so that, can the soul know itself? Can it know itself by looking at itself, or does it have to know itself by looking at its reflection in others? An interesting idea there. And then the idea of, is a soul defined by its necessary relationship with the physical world around it? So I think there was a number of really interesting thoughts there that we can pick up on and certainly think about as we progress in our next two sessions with Phaedo. I think next session, I'll mention at the end as well. Next session, I thought we would go up to 98b. And then the following session, I thought we would finish the rest of the Phaedo. So we've got two more sessions to consider, I think, those points. We'll go to Jose G.
Yes, this comment is half serious and half levity. But when Mosh was talking about the souls and 3 billion souls and 8 billion population, therefore a deficit of 5 billion, therefore they may be zombies. I thought about another hypothesis that says, well, maybe they are repetitive souls out there. In other words, they reuse the inventory, and therefore that's where the term soulmate comes from. My soul has been duplicated somewhere, and somewhere in some part of the world, there will be an individual with a soul identical to mine, because we got a deficit of souls. Anyway, that's all I wanted to mention.
Thanks. And actually, yeah, you mentioned soulmate, and that makes me think of a symposium, I guess, where they talked about how we are kind of divided in two, and we're always looking for our other half. It's an interesting thought that we can explore in this context of, is there a finite number of souls? Did you want to follow up on that, Jose, or okay, or we'll go to Steve.
One point is that Socrates is making the assumption there is a soul, so the discussion is really about the immortality of the soul. So I don't think it's the idea that there is a soul is I believe that would be a dualistic point of view, and I don't think it's necessarily in the scope of the discussion about whether that part of it is true. But the point that J.K. made, there's the name escapes me, but there is a field of thought that all things, not just living things, all things have a essence or a presence, let's say, or just call it a soul. So there is that view, but a lot of the thoughts current is more towards a non-dualist point of view. So just framing the discussion as a dualistic discussion.
Well, thank you for that perspective, and maybe that could just lead us to consider this this short part here at 64C that I've highlighted on the screen, and that's where Socrates makes the statement or asks the question, do we believe that there is such a thing as death? And he says, is it anything else than the separation of the soul from the body? Do we believe that death is this, namely that the body comes to be separated by itself apart from the soul, and that the soul comes to be separated by itself apart from the body? Is death anything else than this? That we set these two distinct things: the body, the physical existence, and the soul is separated by itself. And by itself meaning doesn't require any other thing to sustain it. That the body that it occupied is now gone, but the soul sustains itself. I thought that's the question, I think, really that needs to be addressed, or that we need to have some view on this, whether we accept this idea that the soul can exist without the body, either before birth or after death. And they wind up at the end of today's reading concluding that it can exist without the body before birth. But Seebe's continues to have doubts that it can exist after death. So what happens in this interim period? And that's will occupy the rest of the dialogue, where they go on to provide some proof of that. But this separate, this dual existence of soul and body separate from each other, and this idea that death is nothing other than separation of the soul from the body. It was an interesting way to portray death, certainly as Socrates is about to go to his own death, and he's actually quite happy about this separation, because, as he says in the next part that I've got highlighted from 66E to 67B, he says that the body just provides impure amounts of, or impure levels of knowledge. The body's providing all of this data that just confuses the soul, and so the soul, when it separates from the body, can attain this state of perfect knowledge that is not confused by all of this contradictory data that the body delivers to it. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Well, I had never seen the evidence of the soul, so that doesn't mean it doesn't exist just because I haven't seen it. I'm a scientist, so I traditionally viewed the soul as something that was in a fantasy land. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just because we don't know it in the physical world doesn't mean it doesn't exist. However, I seem to, the sense I have of soul is that, when the body dies, it does leave the knowledge that has been accumulated by that body and the experiences, and it does get disseminated into our society, into the world somehow. It leaves it behind. So, in that sense, I see the soul as being not something ephemeral, but something actually practical, something physical, some transfer of knowledge and experience.
And you pointed out, Bill, I think, that the soul, or call it the soul or call it the animating force or something, your animating force just affected me with what you just said. And so I think, as you said, it's like a transfer of information or a transfer of knowledge. And, I think one of the things about the universe that's been proven is that it operates under a law of conservation of information. And so if we think of the soul as information, like I've got my animating force and my soul as a particular set of information. I'd like to think that is in fact conserved. And as you said, Bill, it can go on to affect people after my body is gone. So whether you can see the soul, the soul is something that's not physical, so it couldn't be seen because you can only see physical things. So I think this is the problem, that we're always looking for evidence of what we can see, and we believe in only what we can see. We don't believe in the unseen. But as we'll see in the next part of the dialogue that we'll look at, we can divide the universe into two realms. There's a physical, visible realm, and there's the invisible realm, and the soul is part of the invisible. And so how do you prove the invisible? Well, that's the real challenge. But as you said, it can definitely have an effect on us. So, and that effect lasts beyond the existence of the physical body. And so maybe that's evidence, of that effect. It's evidence maybe of the fact that the soul exists in some way as information, maybe, as you said, after death. Maybe that's a good way of thinking about it, as information. So we can explore that thought. We'll go to JK and then Moshe.
Yeah, I like this idea of information that you mentioned, that maybe thought, using language and maybe any kind of thought or symbolism or representation is perhaps the closest thing that we might have to what the soul is. It's something that lives on beyond the body, beyond the dissolution of the body. So certain thoughts that live on, like the thoughts of Plato and thoughts of other philosophers, and the spiritual thoughts of religions, different religions, are those that live on, and they kind of like maybe that's the closest that we could have to what the soul is, and yeah.
And let's hold on to that idea about thoughts, because I think that's where we can end today's dialogue. Is this whole thought process that we engage in? This very interesting part that Socrates has, in which they're actually looking for that process of recollection and what it is right at the end of today's reading. So let's hold on to that, and I'll actually flip to that part of the screen as we go to Moshe.
In the philosophy of mind, you might think of the mind as the soul. Certainly, there's something to be said for that particular argument. There's a distinction made between people that have minds and people that don't have minds, and I brought that up earlier when I was talking about a zombie. Because a zombie could be walking around. It doesn't follow from the fact that it's a zombie that is eating your face off, but it could be, it could be walking around and doing things in the world and not be conscious at all. Maybe it's a limited number of things that it could do. But we do have, if zombieism is the idea of physical animation without a mind, then mind or consciousness would be something that could be added to it, or is separate from, the physical, from the physical thing. Now, does it exist after death, or does it exist before death? That's a separate question. But mind is one of those things that enables me to be able to say, it enables me to be able to explain action or behavior. If I see a person, who's playing a game of chess, I can explain that by saying, that he or she is thinking of the rules of the game and the combinations of what is on the board, and looking at the moves that the other person is making, and that their mind is making it so that this is not simply a mechanical thing like two computers playing each other. So I think there's an argument to be made that there is a phenomena called mind or consciousness that I don't know. I guess it requires explanation. Okay, maybe we need to do more than simply say, well, it's there. Okay. Could mind simply be information and something that goes, that gets transferred? I always thought of information, and I could be wrong about this, as an item on a continuum between data and knowledge. I have raw data, I've got ones and zeros. I don't know anything. I don't have any real information there. But information can be derived out of this. These ones and zeros means, that the Soviets have a submarine in the Mediterranean Ocean, and we have 3 submarines outside the gates of Gibraltar. But that is information, but it's not knowledge that we would talk about. Certainly, like we talk about it here. So, could information be passed on from me into, let's say a computer? Would that be passing my mind into the computer? That's a pretty uninteresting kind of entity that you've got there. I mean, if the contents of the information that I have is that we have 3 submarines and the Soviets have 1, and they're separated by the Straits of Gibraltar, I don't know if that works for what Plato's talking about as a soul. On the other hand, I've heard this thing, talked about today several times, about things that we know that have been passed on from generation to generation. And I'm reminded of Achilles in Homer. And Achilles was interested in his reputation. What's your reputation? Well, it's what they say about you after your death. And certainly we've got examples of great religious leaders and political leaders and scientists who a great deal is said about them after their death. Their reputation has succeeded them. I mean, take Plato. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's been dead 2,500 years, and here we are in the 21st century talking over international borders about this guy's reputation. So I don't know where the reputation exists, but I think that part of that reputation represents something on the continuum, not as information, but as knowledge. And I don't know how it gets passed on, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that you can move, from one, from one computing object to another computing object. Or if I use the idea that and I know I'm rambling here, but this is the last point, the materialists, they say that the brain is the mind. Well, suppose my brain and all its little crevices and turning in on itself and things like that gets put into a baby's head. Okay. We've transferred, I think, more than the information. But if it was just the information that we were transmitting, it'd be pretty uninteresting. So that's just my thought points for this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And again, I think, some very interesting perspectives there, Moshe. And I think we're onto something here with what Bill started when he said the word information. And I think, Moshe, you took it to kind of another level when you started talking about mind. And it really made me think when you use the term, is information an item on, I think if I got the quote correctly, is information an item on the continuum between data and knowledge. And I think that really makes me think, actually, and it makes me actually think about what we talked about 2 weeks ago in Philibus in terms of this need to order the data that we have in order to make meaning out of it. And it's the soul's job to take the physical data that it's receiving from the five senses and to put it into some sort of order, so that it's not just information, but it's also meaningful information. And then I think you asked the question, like, what is mind? What defines, and to me, what defines the limit of a mind? Where does my mind stop and your mind start? Really fascinating idea. It makes me think, thinking of mathematics and geometry, a mind would have to be its own derivative. But how do we delineate one mind from the other? So really fascinating thoughts there. And that idea, particularly about information on a continuum between data and knowledge, is something that I think is definitely worth exploring and considering. So we'll go to Bill and then JK.
Well, Plato lived 2,500 years ago, or 2,300, I'm not sure. But yet we're reading his works. And in that sense, his soul still lives, because I can feel him. I know what's in his brain. And what the words are by themselves are just data, but the meaning, when we put them together and read them as one and understand them, it becomes knowledge. So his soul is with me right now as we speak.
Indeed, and it's with me too. And it's a question of, I think you said what's in his mind. I think we can all maybe disagree or have different views of what's on his mind when he wrote this. The interesting thing about Plato is he never says precisely what's on my mind. He never says, I think this to be the case. So it's an interesting question of why he does that, why he doesn't tell us what's on his mind, why he makes us figure it out. And I think it's maybe to spark this kind of discourse, 2,400 years in the future, which leads to some sort of meaning that we derive on our own. And maybe that's part of the mind process, developing our own minds, is to derive our own meaning rather than to have others feed their own meaning into our minds. At some point, we need to arrive at our own understanding and meaning, which is a very powerful and empowering idea, I think. So thank you for that. We'll go to JK.
Yeah, I agree with what Moshe said about that the soul can't be just information. There has to be more than that, and because when you're reading Plato, we're not just getting information; we're getting a sense of meaning and a sense of wholeness and a sense of being. And I think that that's what we get from philosophy, as opposed to some scientific treatise that just describes the world as the physical world. So he's talking about, so the soul is really about what the sense of wholeness is, what being is, and if we can live our life like that, then we're living a life with a sense of meaning and a sense of wholeness and being, and therefore we could live a life with soul, right? And so that sense of soul would be, whether it lives on after your death or not, doesn't matter, because you already know what that how to live your life with that sense of meaning and wholeness. And so a lot of philosophers, like modern day philosophers, do not posit necessarily a metaphysical soul like Heidegger, but he's talking about, he's interested in being. What is being? Okay, with capital B, and that is that sense of wholeness and meaning. That, and the way if you ask him, what the soul is, that's how he would define soul. Interesting
use of words. Wholeness, actually, maybe it's triggering at that connection in my mind, I mentioned, mind being its own derivative. Maybe that sense of being your own derivative is a sense of wholeness. And maybe that's why Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. It's kind of an unwhole life, where you're reacting to others, but you're not being yourself. Maybe that's one idea there. Steve, your thoughts?
Made me think of what Moshe said earlier about the Swerve, which is also a very good book about the discovery of Lucretius's, or the preserving of Lucretius's work, The Nature of Things. But I would say that we're not really reading Plato or seeing his mind. We're seeing the representation of what was Plato that's been translated, that's gone through over those 2,500 years, have gone to, maybe into Arabic, maybe into monasteries, people miscopying or reinterpreting or changing or evolving. So I think what I would feel like we're looking at is a flow of information, a flow of meaning that has made its way to, like you were saying before about the uncertainty principle. If you zoom in on one spot, you can't really measure it. You can't measure that point in time that was Plato's, creating of this or the telling of this. It's changing all the time. It's not only Plato. It's our current, what we're doing at this time, our representation of what ideas we feel that Plato might have had at that time.
Really interesting observation there, Steve. It's I think one of the problems that we have in understanding Plato or anybody else who wrote so long ago and wrote in a different language, and there were different uses of words in that language at the time, is always this issue of translation. And as you said, over 2,400 years, Plato's been translated in different fashions, from Greek to Latin, from Latin to Italian to English, and all of these, every time he's translated, it results in a slightly different understanding. And maybe that's kind of the way our recollection works, is every time you recall something, it's slightly different. And here we've got this issue of translators interposing themselves between Plato's original words and the reasons why he wrote those words, and to where we're here now today. And certainly, as I was reading on in the rest of the dialogue, there is one word in particular that I want to question in translation, because it could have a very different effect on my understanding of what Plato was saying. And maybe this goes back to what Bill was saying earlier in terms of knowing Plato now here as we're reading him so many millennia after he wrote what he did, and to really understand his purpose. And I think, we only have, maybe about 5 minutes or so remaining, but I just wanted to raise this whole idea of recollection before we leave. But Bill, if you wanted to, did you want to add something, Bill?
Well, I just wanted to remark on the uncertainty principle. Mm-hmm. I understand that it holds up in physics, and it's real because it's been shown by experiments. But I don't know if it applies to the realm of the mind, because as an observer in the mind, we can set ourselves apart from what is being observed and just look at what is happening. Now, where that becomes a problem, where the uncertainty, where the observer changes what is observed, is when the bias comes in, when the mind starts playing with that observation. But without that bias, we can possibly see what is really there, keeping the mind open and clear.
I would agree. I think that's a good observation. That definitely the mind is, well, nobody's established that it's subject to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which was developed to apply only to physics, but I don't think it's ever been established that it would apply to the mind, which seems to be unlimited, whereas all of physics is limited. So something that we can definitely consider. and I think that's why, as we learned in the Republic, Socrates says that the soul has to use reason to mediate between the appetites of the body and the spirit. And this is maybe how it navigates this uncertainty that's presented to it by the physical world, which he, says in no uncertain terms, the beginning of today's reading, the body just delivers all sorts of nonsense. I think he uses the word nonsense to the soul, and the soul has to sort it all out. Just wanted to maybe conclude, and just if we can just stay for a few more minutes, just to conclude today's discussion with this little bit about recollection. And, so I think to take it back to the idea of everything coming from opposites. And here at 73C to 75A, Socrates is saying, do we not also agree that when knowledge comes to mind in this way is recollection? What way do I mean? Like this: when a man sees or hears in some way, in some other way, or in some other way perceives one thing, and not only knows that thing, but also thinks of another thing of which the knowledge is not the same but different, are we not right to say that he recollects the second things that come into his mind? And then Simmias says, how do you mean? Socrates says this: things such as this: to know a man is surely a different knowledge from knowing a liar. Liar mean L-Y-R-E, not somebody who tells mistruths. The lyre, the instrument. So, well, you know what happens to lovers. When they see a lyre, a garment, or anything else that their beloved is accustomed to use, they know the lyre, and the image of the boy to whom it belongs comes into their mind. This is recollection, just as someone, on seeing Simmias, often recollects Cebes. And there are thousands of other such occurrences. Simmias agrees, thousands indeed. Socrates says, is this kind of thing not recollection of a kind, especially so when one experiences about things that one had forgotten because one had not seen them for some time? Simmias agrees. And then so they say, well, okay, so one thought will trigger another thought. So I might, as I said earlier, I might think of Plato, and then my next thought might be of Aristotle, or I might think about Plato's dialogues, or I might think about Socrates, or I might think about what I had for lunch. But all of these ideas are different, but some are the same, right? So I might think of Plato, at one point in his life, and I think about him at another point in his life. And so again, it's this idea of establishing this kind of sequence of our thoughts in our minds, as we're talking about mind. And I just wanted to raise this interesting idea about the sequencing of our thoughts. And the sequencing he's saying in this is based on that which is either different or the same. And to know whether something is different or the same, you always need to know where the equal point is, the point of no difference. So I thought this was a really interesting take on this, and maybe we could start our next episode on this kind of point and then take it to the next level, which is when they start talking about the realm of the visible and the invisible. So again, the physics versus the metaphysics of the soul, and they start talking about the composites, which are the physical items, and the non-composites, which are those items that go on in being forever and ever. But I just wanted to highlight this idea about the thought process, and this idea about all knowledge is recollection, which is something that comes through in Plato a number of times. Certainly there's a very specific reference that's made in this section of the dialogue to what happened in the dialogue Meno, when Socrates brings the slave, the uneducated slave, and starts quizzing him on geometric properties. Suddenly the slave just seems to know this without having been taught. But in this dialogue, Socrates says, if you question a person in the right way, which I take to mean question the person in terms of ratios of differences and similarities, that knowledge starts to come out without having been taught. So it's a very powerful thought, I think, and something that maybe we can consider as we go into the next episode. And so I think I should probably end today's episode on this point. And it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think there's a number of points that I'm really, taking forward from this. And I think this idea of the soul as representing some sort of information that's conserved is a really powerful thought that I'm going to take forward from this. So, as I said earlier, we'll continue with the Phaedo in our next 2 episodes. So the next one, we will go from where we left off today to 98b. And there's a really interesting piece of logic at 97e that I would point out in particular. If you have a chance to read that it's about a paragraph in particular at 97e, that would be the point where I'd like to kind of end up the next session on. But I think it's a very important point about logic and maybe about the process in which we actually think. Again, I wanted to thank everybody for being here, and look forward to seeing everybody, I hope, in 2 weeks when we continue our discussion of the Phaedo. And as I am about to end the recording, I would invite anybody who wishes to stay online to stay with us for a casual discussion on Plato or philosophy in general, and it will be unrecorded. So we will end today's recording with thank you all very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.